afternoon, everyone, and good day wherever you may be. I'm Patricia Schuker, founder of the Global Impact Discussion Series at the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs, offering master's degree, executive programs, and a new doctoral program. Feel free to contact IWP for more information. I am thrilled to launch a new sub-series called US East Asia Lecture Series, which will take a unique perspective to strengthen the link between prominent scholars and other experts on Asia and contemporary global issues to promote greater understanding of the East Asia region. This new initiative hopes to continue the important tradition of encouraging scholars and policymakers to learn from one another. I have the distinct honor and privilege of welcoming Dr. Jun Pak, who joined us today in a conversation about her latest book, Becoming Kim Jong Un, a former CIA officer's insight into North Korea's enigmatic young dictator. She's a senior fellow and the SK Korea Foundation chair in Korea Studies at the Brookings Institution. Prior to Brookings, she held senior position at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where she led the US intelligence community's strategic analysis of North Korea as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer. At the CIA, her mission was daunting and challenging as she tried to figure out what is going on inside the mind of Kim Jong Un. I am a huge fan of Dr. Pak's work, and I highly recommend you reading her previous essay, her work, and of course, her book. In her book, Dr. Pak weaves into the story of a lot of different aspects, including explanations of how the CIA studies difficult targets, which is available information to know, how Kim was raised and chosen for leadership, what inspiration he learned watching his father, but also understanding, most importantly, the legacy of his grandfather. Dr. Pak explores how we in the United States have the power to shape this nuclear-armed dictator's future incentives, having come close to going to war in 2017. We're really privileged to have Dr. Pak with us today. We look forward to rich conversation, at the end of which we'll make sure to have enough time for all of your questions online. If you wish to ask them via the Q&A on Zoom or via Facebook Live, I will ultimately transmit those, some of those questions to Dr. Pak. But first, we're going to hear from Dr. Pak with some opening thoughts. I'd like to provide a bit of background because I really enjoyed reading your book. And one of the bottom line that I learned is structural forces alone are not enough to account and explain forth the course of history. We have to look at personalities. This is an important value added that your book is providing. We often heard the famous geography is destiny, history is destiny, but I am a firm believer that biographies and personalities are certainly extremely relevant and often excluded in our policy conversation. This will not only be our topic of discussion, but it will also give us the opportunity to think a little bit more broadly about North Korea, the United States, and the return of great power competitions and other challenges around the globe. First of all, I will allow Dr. Pak to set up the scene a little bit, because you had been at the CIA when the major successions started to play out inside North Korea. There's been a deluge of books on Kim Jong Un and North Korea, and I wanted to ask you, why did you write this book, and when did you start this project, and what you hope to achieve? So again, Dr. Pak, thank you very much for joining us, and without further ado, over to you.
Well, Patricia, thank you so much for that kind introduction and for inviting me to speak to IWP. And thanks to everyone in the audience. I know there are lots of demands on your time with family and schoolwork and your professional careers and other volunteer work. So, and I'm grateful for anybody who spends time with me on these talks or in other discussions. So thanks to all of you, and I look forward to your questions. Patricia, you asked me why I wrote the book. And as you mentioned, I've been watching Kim since he was a young 24, 25-year-old being groomed by his father all the way up to the summits of 2018 and 2019. And so I left the CIA in 2017, and right afterwards there was it was the fire and fury and locked and loaded period of really tense U.S. North Korea confrontation. And of course, as you mentioned, Patricia, there was a deluge. There were reams of print on Kim Jong Un, what's going on, who is he, how do we get here to this place. And I recognize that having been watching Kim for so long, that that there wasn't a comprehensive look at how we got here. There's a lot of great analysis and a lot of really deep expertise outside of the intelligence community, but I found that that a lot of these perspectives were coming from, very good perspectives from arms control backgrounds, or international relations backgrounds, or political science, or East Asian history backgrounds. But that there wasn't this holistic look at what motivates Kim, what are his preferences, what's his personality, and how does that influence his foreign policy decisions and internal decision making. How does history burden but also empower him? And I wanted to note that that before I went into the CIA, I was a history professor of U.S. history in New York City, and so my background is a lot of that history of the looking at biographies, looking at individuals who made a difference, individuals who made choices that changed world history. And so I bring a lot of that into the book, which doesn't read like the things that I used to write in the intel community, but it's much more. It brings in history, it brings in art, it brings in architecture, it brings in culture and marketization and human rights. So it brings in all of those things into this book, and I wanted to show how all of those factors are embedded in Kim's way of thinking, and what that means for the United States.
And those are aspects that you really grasp in your book, and also previous essays, work that you've done before. And I think what will be interesting to understand from your perspective is what we from the outside who had no experience in the intelligence community or in policy, what we understand and what we didn't understand about Kim Jong Un back in 2009, 2010, 2011, when he became the leader. Because you mentioned in your book that you were looking for indications of instability at the time. So what were you looking for then, and what are you looking for now, especially when Kim Jong Un disappears for 3 weeks, and we had this, this brief speculation about his death or incapacitation in April. So what are the kind of vulnerabilities that you've looked at back then and now, to the limits that you can share?
I mean, some of the things that you would look for are big movements in the country, whether it's troop movements or people voting with their feet, average North Koreans, or signs of unrest, what's happening with foreigners who might be located there, unusual movements or recalling of people from overseas. And I think some of those concerns and some of those things that we might have looked at, I think that was really complicated or really amplified by the fact that we had a 26, 27-year-old who had very little government experience, much less experience running a country that has nuclear weapons. And so given the fact that that Kim Jong Un was so young, given the fact that his grooming process was just a handful of years versus his father, who had a couple of decades of tutelage under his father, that amplified fears about a collapse or an implosion within the country, or that there might be a military coup or some sort of movement against this young leader who was going to be taking over for his father. But as it turned out, and I tease this out in the book, is that that Kim Jong Un has blown through all of those, all of that skepticism, and that he really became leader of North Korea with more swagger and confidence than one might expect from somebody who was so young and so inexperienced.
Mm-hmm. And in the book, actually, to follow up what you just say, you talk about the aspect of functioning bureaucracy. which is often underappreciated, given that North Korea is an extremely organized system. Efficiency is questionable, though, and I think, having studied intelligence, or having, if you enjoy novels on intelligence, I think we're all familiar with the novel by John le Carré on the spy who came in from the cold. And that reminded me of, where the so-called defective spy asked his East German handler, I always admired your system. It's so efficient. And the East German responds, well, don't make mistake efficiency for organization. We're just well organized. So my question for you would be, how Kim Jong Un stays in power, since you've seen the evolution, and what has changed as much from what you've observed in 2009 to today in 2020.
I think that's a great observation, Patricia, in that I think when you look at North Korea, its economy is at the bottom of the barrel. It's run by this dictator who threatens to kill everybody and bomb the United States. And one assumes that it's this brittle and very fragile country that with the puff and a huff that it's just going to collapse. And I think that's not the case. And what Kim enjoys is an institutional structure and an infrastructure of fear and repression that really holds the country together. So on the one hand, the country and the bureaucracies are very stovepiped, and that's by design. It's to ensure that there's no horizontal conspiracy or collaboration. It's to keep people stovepiped into their own very narrow area of expertise. And the fear goes to that second rung, or the second category, which is that it keeps people, keeps people fearful of saying their mind or trusting anybody, their coworkers, or even their family members. And that keeps people from speaking out freely. And this is the case in North Korea in general. But I would also, I also argue in the book that as soon as Kim came to power, he started purging hundreds of officials, and not just mid-level or lower-level officials. He was lopping off organizations at the head. And of course, so when we look at, I consider how at his father's funeral procession, Kim Jong Un was surrounded by 7 senior officials, whom we all understood as being protectors or regents or the leaders of these bureaucracies that were to prop him up and to ensure continuity in the regime and to lend legitimacy to this young dictator. But what Kim had done in the first 2 years of his rule was that he purged 5 out of the 7, and the other 2 were slowly marginalized or disappeared. And so they got into accidents, they disappeared, they were never heard from again. And that puts another heavy pall on the bureaucracy, in that you're not going to stick your head up and say something against this the young leader, but that you're going to try to keep your head down to try to protect not just yourself, but also your family members and the people closest to you.
Yeah, and also the way he operated as well was often compared to his grandfather more than his father. And like you said in the book, they have a chapter called Bigger, Better, Bolder, which I think is very encapsulated and summarizes his personality, even though without knowing the leader. But I think the growing confidence is one aspect. But how do you factor in the impact of sanction as a motivation as well for him, and how would you look at the second part of his policy on economic engagement, like you mentioned, and modernization, because at the end he wants to modernize the country as much as he can and develop partnerships and so forth. So is he moving beyond the nuclear issue? Is he saying, okay, nukes are here, but now I need to know how I need to upgrade the economy?
You talk about the confidence, and I think even his father, Kim Jong-il, could not have imagined how adept and adroit that his son would be, his youngest child would be, in dealing with leading this country among these very larger, more powerful, wealthier countries. And so what Kim does right away is he has this sense of confidence and swagger that I think, and this goes to the biography and looking at the personalities and looking at the context in which he was born and raised, that unlike his grandfather and father, so his grandfather had to fight Japanese guerrillas. He saw famine. The grandfather saw his uncles and his father and mother being beaten, starving children, the disgrace of being taken over by a foreign country, fighting in the cold Manchurian battlefields, and fighting against the greater powers. Kim Jong-il had to suffer the indignity of the collapse of the Soviet Union and all of the aid and the political concessions and political support that the North Koreans were able to generate as a result of that relationship. There was a famine that killed as many as 1 million people, and the fact that North Korea's economy began to go into a downward spiral very quickly. Kim Jong-un, on the other hand, has only known an economically growing North Korea. In his adult life, he has only known a nuclear North Korea. And of course you would say that that's true of his generation as well. So as time passes, he is reaping the benefits of his father's and his grandfather's labor. And the fact that Kim is confident, I think that is born out of the fact that he has only known positive outcomes. And being surrounded by sycophants and being surrounded by servants and people who are afraid to tell him or to criticize anything that he says or does, you can imagine how that would feed into his sense that he can do no wrong. That even if something does go wrong, it's not his fault, but it's the fault of others who are not appropriately indoctrinated, who are not appropriately listening to his guidance or appropriately believing hard enough on the socialist and the communist project that North Korea is. And so I think that is where we run into danger, where how does Kim know how long his leash is? And I think he has been able to calibrate that. He has been able to calibrate provocative actions. But what I worry about is that in the future, and maybe we can get to this later in this conversation, is that that he might think that his leash is longer than it is as a result of his growing nuclear weapons capabilities, cyber capabilities, and other means that he has been honing.
And I'll shift gears a little bit, and since you brought up how he's seen North Korea and how his grandfather seen North Korea, and shift gears with regards to China. I think that's an interesting way of, I think, adding it right now in the conversation, because the United States has employed a lot of a carrots and sticks approach in dealing with North Korea and continues to prevaricate over the approach. And its difficulty in defining a clear path basically reinforces Pyongyang's stance, and at the same time confirmed the rise of China as the most effective mediator on the issue. And I believe that Beijing most likely has no interest in completely supporting Pyongyang's dangerous foreign policy, given the difficulty it presents in terms of bilateral and multilateral relations for China. So Kim Jong Un's relationship with China seems to be much more amicable than it was between the PRC and his father, Kim Jong-il. So do you foresee Beijing having more influence and control over Kim as their relationship continues to mature?
Actually, the relationship between Kim and Xi Jinping is very poor. The two men do not trust each other. And when we look back on the two men's rise, they rose to leadership at around the same time. Xi Jinping became the leader in 2013. Kim Jong Un became the leader in December 2011. And of course, even before 2013, Xi Jinping was being touted as the next leader of China. So, so when we look at that, the first 6 or 7 years of Kim Jong Un's rule and of Xi Jinping's reign, that the two were not really on speaking terms. Kim Jong Un, because as a result of his desire to really press forward and press the accelerator on the nuclear weapons program. He was not listening to Beijing. High-level visits came to a near standstill. The lights were dark at the Chinese embassy because there was just not that much going on, and that the ties that his father had tried to build up in advance of the succession really ground to a halt. But that said, since 2018, Xi Jinping has made greater efforts to make nice with Kim Jong Un, and Kim Jong Un has been doing the same. And those are different, they have different motivations for doing that. So while in the first 6 or 7 years of Kim Jong Un's rule, Kim was much more focused on the weapons program, regardless of China's ire. In the past couple of years, Kim sees an opportunity to benefit and put and hedge between the United States and China. So from Xi Jinping's perspective, Beijing's leaders were very much concerned as soon as President Trump said in March of 2018 that he was willing to meet with Kim Jong Un. So it wasn't. And so what China has tried to do since early 2018 is to bracket every single U.S.-North Korea meeting with a meeting of their own. They've also bracketed every single inter-Korean meeting with a meeting of their own. And that is to make sure that they know what's going to happen, and to also get the readout after what happens, and to direct and shape and influence in the way that would be amenable or more positive for that would support China's preferences. But that said, Kim is there's no love lost between Kim and Chinese leaders, whereas his grandfather and father had long ties with Chinese leaders, long ties with China, given their long tenures in power, traveling there, or with these going through fighting the Korean War together, that there are very special, fraternal ties between the father and the grandfather and Chinese leaders. Not true with Kim Jong Un. He spent 4 years of his childhood in Switzerland. He was not somebody who was traveling to China to learn in China by any means. And so I would say that the ties between Kim Jong Un to Beijing are much more frayed and much more fragile than I think we give that credit for. But Kim also recognizes that he needs China's support. And that explains Kim's charm offensive at this point. Even as Kim Jong Un is saying really horrible, nasty things to South Korean President Moon, and shutting the door on diplomacy with the United States, and really and calling U.S. officials, Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo, really terrible names, that Kim has refrained from saying anything negative about China. In fact, he has applauded or sent praise to Xi Jinping for his successful handling of the coronavirus. North Koreans released a statement supporting China's sovereignty and autonomy in its dealings with Hong Kong and Taiwan. And so Kim recognizes who butters his bread. I think we're going to see that for the near, at least for the near to midterm. But when push comes to shove, Kim, his focus is on ensuring that he has the autonomy, and that he's not afraid to thumb his nose at China, despite the fact that despite the fact of this overwhelming economic and political dependence on China.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned China's support, because in some ways China is supporting them in the shadows when it comes to technology. And this is why I want to bring the discussion where I was very happy to see a chapter on cybersecurity, and how North Korea is exploring, the Bitcoin mining, cyber attacks. So on the economic front, how does Kim finances what he wants? And I think we've seen, and you mentioned it in the book, is making military first great again, but it's also making cyber first great again in his stance, because for some for some people who are not as much familiar with how North Korea operates on the technology and the cyber side, the only thing that comes to mind is the Sony attack in 2014. But North Korea has been extremely active since 2009, where it started on July 4th with the DDoS attack against 27 US companies and commercial websites, because they usually attack the United States during holidays because everyone is not as focused to tackle those threats. We've seen, you know, the 10 days of rain attack, also DDoS attack. So they've been conducting operations for a long time. And it's, you know, the Sony was a game-changing, like you pointed out in your chapter, for two reasons, mainly because it showed that the US, that North Korea can disrupt operation and information, but also as well, the second aspect is how North Korea has the capability to be so destructive against a corporation, a US entity. So I wanted you to maybe offer a little bit of the perspective you offer in this chapter, which I think will really help understand what North Korea is doing in this domain.
You know, one of the key takeaways that on that cyber issue is that in 2014, I was the when Sony attack happened, I was the Deputy National Intelligence Officer on the National Intelligence Council. And I remember this sense of, wow, North Korea did this. They attacked a US company and threatened 9/11 type attacks. Now, remember, this was in the context of Aurora, Colorado, when when somebody with a gun shot all these people, and the fact that North Korea or some of these hackers associated with North Korea was threatening that kind of violence at a movie theater. You know, it resonated deeply with a lot of people. But you know, I think even to this day, there's some people who are very credible, suggest that it can't have been North Korea. There's no way that it could have been North Korea. And the Sony executives at the time in 2014 said, hey, nobody told us that North Korea can do this. Mm-hmm. And of course, the regime had threatened, even, you know, when the trailers came out, you know, 6 months prior to the actual showing of the movie, that this is a disgrace. This was a grave insult, and they called it an act of war. If Sony went ahead with this movie. Now, this movie, of course, for people who haven't seen it, it's a bro-com where Seth Rogen and James Franco are recruited by the CIA to go into North Korea to try to assassinate Kim Jong Un. And so, you know, people at the time said, I can't believe this is happening. How could it be North Korea? This is crazy. But the intel community in pretty quick order, and of course, this is, you know, this was a whole of government affair, really, you know, came out and fully assessed that North Korea and North Korean entities were involved in this hack. And one of the things that was, you know, that's troubling, and this is, I think, true, Patricia, and I know in your work you've considered this as well, is that it's not so much of people dying or money being withheld, but it's the fear. I don't think we've seen any North Korean movies since then. And that, you know, Sony for a while said they weren't going to show the movie because they weren't, you know, they didn't want to cause any trouble, and they were nervous about, you know, what North Korea might do. But at the time, you know, even President Obama and lots of other experts said, you know, if, you know, this dictator in North Korea can't tell us what movies we're going to watch, what movies can be made. And if there's a dictator who is being mocked, then he probably deserves to be mocked, and that this is our free society. But I think what is so what puts a pall on this affair is that it is nerve-wracking. That you can be held hostage to this country. To this day, North Korea denies that they did it, but since then, they've been involved in several other heists, mining their own Bitcoin, and given some of the sanctions implementation on more traditional activities. This is a new frontier for North Korea to try to generate revenue for the regime, which we assume and assess would be going directly into the nuclear weapons program and into Kim's priority projects.
Yeah, and I'm glad you touched on the nuclear program, because I have so many follow-up questions, but this one will be the last for me, and I'll let everyone prepare the questions on Facebook and Zoom. It's the question of perception, because you mentioned that a lot, given also your previous work in intelligence. That's also a key aspect. And there's been, with all the summit that we've seen, successful or not, depending on how we judge it and how we see it, there's been a lot made of President Trump as a transactional president, out of the deal, but some suggested that he sees himself more as a transitional president, more of a Reagan-esque figure. And I think depending on where things will go with the election and so forth, he still remains, replicate a lot of what President Reagan did before. And one of the article I've read, I can't recall from whom, but during one of the summit, the North Korean vice foreign minister had with him a book that he was reading about Gorbachev and Reykjavik and Reagan. And I think that in some ways, the North Koreans see themselves as being the new Soviets, or which can make some people sigh regarding that. But I think that if you ask them, they see themselves as just being three powers in the Pacific, and it's the United States, China, and ourselves. I think that's what they would say. So I think there's no estimation of how they see themselves. I think that some people suggested that what we're seeing now with Trump is maybe a Kim Yo Jong, Jimmy Carter meeting, or maybe he sees himself more as wanting to break away from his father and grandfather, like you mentioned. So I wanted to get your perspective I understand nobody has a crystal ball, but given where we've been from the summit, successful or not, how do you see North Korea as having more of the new Soviet position of the 23rd century, or is it a complete new perspective that we're seeing from them?
What's so interesting is that I think the failure of the Hanoi summit in February of 2019 was a huge disappointment, and Kim Jong Un was deeply embarrassed by it. You don't take a 70-hour train ride from Pyongyang to Hanoi to just leave it in the middle before lunch and just scurry back to Pyongyang. And so I think this, Kim had really high expectations and high hopes that President Trump could deliver. But President Trump, of course, said that he was not going to lift sanctions before North Korea denuclearizes, and that there was very little give from the president's side. So I think that was deeply embarrassing for Kim. So I think that while before Hanoi that Kim might have thought that this was something that could be a transformative event, I think what Hanoi and the accompanying months and years have shown Kim is that that was to reinforce and validate his belief that he can only trust himself. That presidents come and go, and of course this is something that his father and his grandfather knew. Presidents come and go. Administrations change. They jettison the prior administration's policies and treaties and agreements. And this is something that President Trump has done, trying to unravel many of the things that the Obama administration made agreements on. And so I think what Kim has learned firsthand, versus reading or learning about it, through looking at what happened with his father and grandfather, is that he is surrounded by people, that he can only trust himself, that he's in charge of North Korea's sovereignty and autonomy, and that if anything, it would only deepen his belief that he needs nuclear weapons. He needs to keep developing them. But and this is where the danger comes in, is that after all the fire and fury of 2017, what Kim has learned is that the US has no appetite for war or any type of military conflict on the Asian continent. And so that makes me think that that Kim thinks that his leash is longer than it really is, and that the next time he starts threatening to detonate a bomb over the Pacific Ocean, or the next time he threatens to hit Guam, that the next president, or President Trump, if that's the case, might take him seriously, and that there might be a series of miscalculations that lead to an actual military confrontation. So I think that's something that we really have to be watching out for, regardless of who the next president is. Let's look at how Kim's confidence is growing, and how his desire to make progress on economic developments might lead him to lash out to shore up his support internally, as well as to show the outside world that he's not going to be cowed by an economy that's not doing very well.
Yeah. I have so many follow-up questions, but I'll open up to the audience because I see that we have a lot of very good questions. One of them is, when Kim Jong Un went missing from public view several months ago, speculation was rampant that Kim was severely ill, and that his sister, Kim Yo Jong, was the likely heir apparent. Can you comment on her status, position, and whether it's fact that she's likely will be the likely successor of her brother?
Yeah, you know, Kim has had fewer appearances this year, and let's look at some of the observables, right? He's had fewer public appearances this year, at least based on what we see in regime media. Secondly, his health is not great. He is obese. He smokes heavily, he drinks heavily, and you can see from pictures that the regime releases that he's just getting bigger as he ages. And when we saw him at the summits, even during short walks to meet up with President Moon or President Trump, you could hear the wheezing, you know, without the soft filters of the North Korean media and the propaganda machine. You can hear Kim wheezing, breathing heavily, sweating a lot, and walking in a very awkward way, which I think is in part due to his girth and his health status. So at this point, we still don't know what happened, why he disappeared for 3 weeks back in April of 2020. And this is also when we start to see Kim Yo Jong, his younger sister, start to make statements on her own, which she had not done before. I think there's a tendency to see the three men who had led North Korea to downplay the role that a woman might play in the regime. But I've argued elsewhere that Kim Yo Jong, even at the age of 30-something, has as much bureaucratic and government experience as her brother had when he came to power. She's been at her brother's side doing various things and has held senior leadership positions in the regime since at least 2014. And regardless of her womanhood, or in the fact that she's a female Kim, what really matters in this Kim dynasty is the bloodline. And so in October and December of 2019, this is when Kim Jong Un and his sister and his wife and other, you know, senior officials took that horseback ride up to Mount Baekdu, you know, which is where the mythical place, this very sacred place where the Kim dynasty started. That was by design. Kim wants her at his side, and I think that she's got the experience. And at a minimum, with the blowing up of the liaison office under her orders, at a minimum, her brother wants her to have military credentials to make it look as if that the military follows her and supports her, and that she has that gravitas just in case.
Yeah. And do you believe the military will follow her lead?
Yes, I do. I think that that given the propaganda and the deep structure that really depends on, that elevates the Kim family, that really gives her a step up, and that And I don't think we need to say anything. I don't think we should assume that the military officials or senior officials feel differently or have different views about North Korea's direction than what the Kim family is doing. So, so I think even if something happened to the Kims or to Kim Jong Un, that the military or whomever comes to power would find it useful to have a Kim as a figurehead at a minimum.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of fascination for her sister. I get a lot of questions, so I'll do follow up. One person asked, what role do you think Kim Jong Un's sister has played in either her brother's grooming for being the leader of North Korea and or to maintain his current control of the country?
So Kim Yo Jong has been at her brother's side. She leads the propaganda and agitation department. She was there, you can see her hovering and lurking in the background. She was at the summits with President Trump holding his ashtray, showing, giving her brother the pen, making sure that all of his papers were in order, carrying his bag, carrying the suitcase. So she's his de facto chief of staff. And so that clearly shows that he has the utmost trust in his little sister. And so I think that what Kim might be doing, judging from what we've seen, the fact that he's been elevating her, the fact that she's issuing statements in her own name, and she's ordering these military actions that her brother is trying to hone, or at least to continue to elevate his sister, and to delegate some responsibilities to her. What are the motivations for that? I think it could be a number of things. It could be even a dictator has only so many hours in the day that he might be trying to delegate some of these things to his little sister, to make it a real family affair. It could also be, and these are not mutually exclusive, it could also be that if something goes wrong, he can blame the sister. Mm-hmm. And to shield him and protect himself or inoculate himself from things that could go wrong.
Yeah. I've got an interesting question on social media from someone who's following Japanese politics, especially now with the new leader. And they ask, since we spend time on Kim Jong Un, how do you factor in Moon Jae-in on the South Korean side, and the lead that they feel they've taken, and also what may be the difficulties with all of these changes in Washington and in Japan to try to see how it's registering and how to keep US-South Korea relation, how to keep the light between them.
I think one of the difficulties of the past couple of years with the summits. So on the one hand, President Trump has been pretty harsh on the alliances, has been seeing alliances in a very transactional way, has always beaten up South Korea over host nation support or the trade deal, or why do we have troops in South Korea? And he's been very public and very open about that, not just as president, but in the decades before he became president. But on the other hand, the President Moon was the one who made this happen, made the summits happen. If you recall, it was the South Korean president's envoys that went to North Korea first, and I suspect really massaged and polished whatever they said to Kim and whatever Kim said to them about denuclearization and desire to meet. And so that's how the summitry happened. But as soon as that connection between Kim and Trump happened, I think the effect of that was that it marginalized South Korea. South Korea doesn't have the power to get rid of sanctions. We don't either. It has to be congressionally approved, and we should go to the UN. But that leader to leader connection between Kim and Trump marginalized everybody else, and that's why Xi Jinping came running over to make sure that he was in on the game. That's why Putin came running over to make sure that he was in the game. Prime Minister Abe, the former Prime Minister Abe, tried with very little success to get anything with Kim, and so despite all of this, President Moon has been trying desperately to try to get North Korea to sign on to further engagement. whether it's economic, military dialogue, and political meetings. But, you know, I think you can't dance alone. North Korea has made it clear that they don't want to deal with Moon. I think there's a sense of betrayal that I think President Moon might have promised more than actually happened. And that there's certainly a lot of harshness and vitriol that Kim holds for the Moon administration. So, but regardless, President Moon seems very much intent on pushing forward against the locked door, from my perspective.
Yeah. There's some questions on the denuclearization and the future of North Korea, depending on which president gets elected in the fall, without going into speculation as much. Could you envisage a set of circumstances or some realistic conditions that will actually convince the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons? And if you cannot, then does the situation remain irresolvable given what the US objective is, which is presumably to denuclearize the peninsula?
Yes, that's why we have policymakers, and that's why we have diplomacy, is that we have to keep pushing and to try to make as you know, small progress where we can, big progress where we can, where possible, because the alternative is not where we want to be. The alternative is we recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapons power. We will not do that because of the message that it sends to other rogue states. Stick it out, just stick it through, disregard, threaten your neighbors, develop these capabilities, proliferate them to other bad actors. So we don't want to acknowledge that. We don't want to reinforce that kind of behavior. And we also want to maintain and build and reinforce the non-proliferation regime that that we and our partners have been working so hard at building. So, you know, the key here is to have Kim understand and internalize that nuclear weapons make him less safe, and that nuclear weapons make his survival less secure, and that he sees that choice between he has to make that choice between regime survival or having nuclear weapons. We're still on the negative side of the ledger in that Kim sees nuclear weapons as ensuring his survival, and it's been baked into the regime's architecture, its art, its classroom histories, its arithmetic, and its culture, its, you know, and its amusement parks, etc. And so, given that, it's going to be a very steep hill to climb, but I think the alternatives are not where we want to be.
Yeah, and we get a lot of speculation and comments online about, you know, what happened if Kim Jong Un decides to just move on, you know, and just move away from the Kim dynasty and towards reunification and democracy, and that I think begs the questions to, you know, comparing two systems, right? North Korea as being a dynasty versus the United States being an electoral politics. So one question was, you know, how, you know, what America's North Korea policy would look like after November. And it's difficult to say, obviously, but what would be, you know, are we going to see more love letters that we already seen, or are we going to see more meetings? How do you see that going forward? Because I think now we've reached a point where there's going to be some time of quiet, basically, where President Trump's focus won't be as much on North Korea, but more on the election. But after that, depending on who will be in the White House, how do you see, you know, the approach from Kim Jong Un and likewise on the U.S. side?
Yeah. So I think that I mean, I think. The problem here is that Kim Jong Un gets the vote, the most important vote on what's going to happen. And the fact that he is a singular actor versus the United States, we have Congress, we have an executive branch, we have, you know, various bureaucracies, and we need the support of our allies and partners across the globe to tackle North Korea. So that there is just that's just the way the field is. And I think that, you know, I spent my career looking at things from Kim's perspective. And I think from Kim's perspective, that is that coercive diplomacy pays off. So from my view, it's just a matter of time before we see some big weapons demonstration. And that, and from Kim's view, putting a wedge among the allies between the US and South Korea, between South Korea and Japan, between China and the United States, that works because the weaker we are, the better it is for North Korea. So if I were Kim, I would continue to do that, keep things bilateral. I would try to keep talking about how hostile the United States is, to try to make sure that there are no more US-South Korea military exercises, that there are no more movies made that make North Korea look in a bad light, that no one talks about North Korea's human rights violations because that would be offensive to them, right? So I think those are some things that reinforce Kim's rule, that reinforce his hold on power. And also really highlight some of the deep, really, the difficulties that we face in crafting a sustainable, principled diplomacy to try to get North Korea back to the table and to engage in a really substantive way rather than just, you know, these very fluffy summits.
Yeah. There's one more question. How closely do you see China and North Korea cooperating or collaborating on their respective ballistic weapons program? Yeah.
I don't know that there is any ballistic missile cooperation. I think if anything, Beijing, you know, China serves as a good transit point for North Korea's proliferation activities. China has to walk a very, you know, they have to be very mindful of the fact that, you know, to make sure that North Korea doesn't collapse and to give enough support that Kim doesn't, you know, and to try to keep Kim tethered. But they also don't want to empower Kim to think that he can just do whatever he wants. So even, you know, they're not going to give Kim the green light by saying, we're going to defend you no matter what. We're going to come to your aid no matter what. I don't think that's anything that they would say privately or publicly. But from China's perspective, Beijing blames us. Beijing blames South Korea and Japan for the way North Korea lashes out and for North Korea's development of its weapons capabilities.
And do you think it's possible to convince Kim that nuclear weapons threaten his regime's viability instead of protecting it?
Well, you know, that's what we were trying to do with the sanctions. That you know, in addition to proliferation activities, sensitive, you know, selling sensitive nuclear and ballistic missile technologies. North Korea made a lot of money from coal exports rather, seafood, textiles, iron ore, and a lot of those natural resources that were a boon for senior military officials, anybody associated with these trading companies, and for the regime, because they can start vacuuming up as taxes. So with the intent of this maximum pressure sanctions, which I really supported with the Trump administration, was that that if you know, Kim said he wanted to have both, you know, North Korea was going to have nuclear weapons and economic prosperity. What the US was trying to do is to show that, no, we're going to squeeze that economic prosperity prong of your goal, and it's going to sharpen the choice for Kim that he can have economic prosperity or nuclear weapons. The problem with the summitry of 2018 and 2019 is that it really let the air out of the pressure campaign. And that was almost certainly Kim's intent, by turning or pivoting toward diplomacy, was to try to dampen the appetite for sanctions implementation, not just by US, but also China, Southeast Asian countries, African, Middle Eastern countries.
Yeah. There's more questions, but we're running out of time. So I will leave some time as well for you, Dr. Pak. So let me thank you again for joining us. I thank you very much for your time. I really enjoyed this discussion, and for all today, thank you. I really recommend you reading Dr. Pak's book. And thank you, IWP, for hosting this webinar. And I wish everyone manages to stay well, sane, and safe. So thank you very much, Dr. Pak. And I hope to welcome you in person at IWP.
Thank you, Patricia. And and thanks to all of you for your questions and for tuning in today.
Thank you.